Hello there, and welcome back to Valdis Story. Last time we made it to the abandoned library and made it our base. Oh yeah, also we saved one of our friends' lives, Vladin or something? I can never remember the guy. So here we're just changing up our armor back to the Wanderer's Raiment since it's overall better than the Gladiator's Vest. For our build at least. We also used that one level up to purchase a skill in the magic skill. An increase to our MP. It's not going to be super useful, but it will lead to better skills later on. So this here is the Borsk. We'll be seeing exactly what he does later, but to wit, he is a spell trainer, upgrading the power of the spells that you obtain. It's not really necessary to utilize his services at the moment though. So this here is Gilda, one of the 4 playable characters, one of the 2 that was added later on in development. And she's pretty strong. She honestly doesn't need our help here, but we're gonna help anyway, cause Reina's just a helpful person. Unfortunately, Gilda is not exactly the most forthcoming with gratitude. She doesn't seem to like Reina, and she's not afraid of being very forthright with that fact. And that's about all we'll be seeing of her from now on. The other playable characters don't really come into play all that much in the one that you're playing as campaign. At least not until the very end. So with the business at the library solved, we're going to head back to Rock and see if we can't do anything else there. I'm sure that Elder Brager would be happy to put another task on our laps. Of course, that requires traveling all the way back there on foot. This game doesn't exactly have a very robust fast travel system. Really, the only method of fast travel is the tramway that we helped repair here in Huck. Fortunately though, the game doesn't really need much more fast travel because it is a fairly small game world, so it doesn't take too long to traverse through the various areas. Well, Brazier doesn't seem to have any tasks for us, and consulting this merchant, we're just 2 steel away from being able to purchase one of the most useful items in the game. Fortunately, steel is very easy to acquire, so that's not really going to be an issue. And hey, it looks like Claudia repaired the tramway here in Huck. So now we can travel all the way back to Tagrum. And if we come across any more tramways in other towns, all we have to do is resync them and boom, another fast travel point. I'm just gonna spoil it now, there's actually only one other fast travel point in the game. As I said, not a very robust fast travel system, but I'm glad it's there. It does cut down on the backtracking that's necessary. So now Adelan here is going to join us. Not without misgivings from Reina, but she ultimately convinces her. I do like this little detail though of the fact that most of the reason Adelan has been able to survive this long when scouting is because she's kind of incredibly weak, and that's out of the notice of most of the angels and demons. Despite being weak though, she will be very useful to us, for she is a new assist. Now, in terms of damage, she doesn't offer too much more than Faulan, and she doesn't have a bonus property when you summon her, like Faulan's MP regeneration, but she has the ability to cause bleeding with her attacks, and that's pretty useful since otherwise Reina doesn't really have access to that status effect. In fact, we'll have a particular use for it not too long from now. It's almost as if they gave you Adelan right when she's the most useful. Game design, ladies and gentlemen. So yeah, as I mentioned, steel is not difficult to acquire. You can just pick up as much as you need from Barbaroy up there, as well as a few other merchants. Well, not as much as you need, it's limited, but you're probably not going to buy out his stock. So now we have enough for the Superior Mana Keystone, and the reason why it's such a good item is it does 2 incredibly useful things. The first is it makes it that when you're charging those mana stones for puzzles, you now do it instantly, and this is really important for the more stress-timed ones. Oh, of course, now we acquire a free piece of steel. Also, just bringing up the minimap here for a second, I don't think I've done that before. We have 2 ways of heading west to Ishk. One up ahead in the Tagrum derelicts that we explored earlier, which leads across the Skyway, and one here in Tagrum, which leads through the sewers. Now, I know, sewer levels in video games aren't the most exciting, and this one really isn't either. It's a lot of tight enclosed spaces, which really doesn't work with the combat all that well, at least in my opinion. But overall, I feel it's the easier of the two stages, and it has an incredibly useful item, so it's usually worth taking this path as opposed to the upper one. We'll be doing the other one eventually, of course, but for now, this is how we'll be making our way to Ishq. So I got a little bit distracted, but the other thing that the superior Mana Keystone does is it upgrades your blocking to a Perfect Guard ability. This means you can block 100% of damage from any attack, even if it's heavy and even if it's magic. Previously, magic would have done chip damage through the block and a lot of spells would have broken our guard much like a heavy attack. But now that's no longer the case, and it means that if you're able to react quickly enough, you can avoid taking damage pretty easily, even with some of the more hectic fights that ends up going on. The only real difficulty is the fact that the blocking is unidirectional. It only blocks directly in front of you, so you will have to shift the direction that you're facing for it to be effective. This can be a pretty tall order in some of the hectic fights, but then again, you can just use your skill cancel plus dodge. Or if you want to be really badass, you can figure out which attack from which side is going to come first. Parry that and use the iframes that result from a successful parry and counterattack to iframe through any damage that occurs. Yeah, this game gives you a lot of defensive options in the combat, and it's one of the things that I really love about the combat system. As long as you're paying attention and are able to react quickly enough, you can pretty easily do no damage runs of bosses or even entire levels. Now, straight up, I'm not good enough to do that, but it is possible, and you can find no damage runs of a lot of bosses, usually S-ranked as well, on YouTube. I mean, if you do a no damage boss, you are going to get an S-rank pretty much guaranteed. So with most of the enemies on this screen dead, we can do one of these timed sequences. You absolutely want to clear the enemies beforehand. If they get in your way, you're pretty much guaranteed to not make it. Especially this one, which is timed fairly tight. But it is absolutely worth the doing. That incredibly useful item I mentioned that's worth solely going through this route instead of the upper one, this is it. So ignoring everything else that the armor offers and laser focusing on one particular aspect even though its other bonuses are quite good, it gives you an extra skill cancel. Early on when you have one, maybe two if you got lucky with your rare drops, having an extra skill cancel for effectively free is invaluable. And even ignoring that its best bonus, it's still pretty good armor besides. Plus 2 to agility, which we'll gladly take, plus 2 to intelligence, which is also useful since it makes our God Hand buff stronger. And importantly, it gives you a special bonus of stealing MP from enemies whenever you do crits. And as an agility focused build, we'll be doing crits more often and more often as we level up. The Judicator's Raiment is pretty much up there with the Paladin's Armor in terms of just sheer usefulness for a lot of builds. It's pretty great. So getting back to matters at hand, Edgar here is pretty badass. I really wish we could have done that, just wipe out enemy attack, and maybe we will in the future, who knows. We're also going to be noping out of that new area we just discovered, the Hollow. As you may have noticed if you were paying attention, it too has the frozen effect that the previous icy area we explored had, which means constant damage over time. It's also tuned difficulty-wise to be way more difficult than the sewers. You can do it now, but I really wouldn't recommend that. There is actually some really good shit to be had from that area, but it's not worth coming from this side because that stuff is on the right side of the area, and coming from the left entrance, there's a right entrance as well that is a lot more convenient. We would end up having to fight the boss, which no, not doing that at this point. This is an action game, but it's an action RPG, and stats matter, and that boss is a bit outstatted for us at the moment. So, right here we just saw that Adelan leveled up. You may have noticed that with Faolon in one of the earlier episodes. Using an assist enough will cause them to level up, and that increases their overall power. Honestly not super useful with Adelan since we're not going to be using her for damage. and I'm pretty sure her bleed chance is dependent on your ability to crit. She doesn't have a separate one, so leveling her up doesn't increase the likelihood of that happening. So this room right here is perhaps the rudest room in the entire area. We have one of these angel gunslingers and 2 big shield boys on either side. It's really nasty because if any of the enemies end up within the zone of the shield, they'll have a fast regeneration effect like those enemies themselves, and they'll also constantly revive the angels. Thankfully they can't revive the gunslingers, not here. It's honestly annoying enough to deal with that I would actually recommend ignoring them for the most part. We'll be taking them down just because, but it's usually best just to ignore them. You're just gonna waste time and possibly lives because it is a pretty tricky combat situation. That's why I elected to activate focus mode so early on in the encounter. It just makes it go by that much more quickly. That and the fact that as an agility mode, we'll be using focus mode a lot, especially as we level up and we're able to fill it faster and it lasts longer. That's one of the really nice things about having an agility focused build in this game, is that the focus mode becomes less of a super mode and more of just a constant buff you use a lot of the time. Think Goku's Kaioken. I had to make an anime reference, come on, it's a very anime game. So one reason to take down all those enemies is it does make retreating back up here for this time puzzle a little bit easier. But even if you leave the enemies alive, the time limit is generous enough that it's really not that difficult to do. So I wouldn't really say it's necessary. And the reward for such an easy challenge is not that great. Extra mana is nice, but since we're not really a spell slinging build, we don't especially need it. Still, best not to look a gift horse in the mouth. A considerably more useful item lies over here, another Book of the Old Gods. We'll have to get this to Vlad next time with the library. We're not gonna head there just for that though, we have plenty more of the crew to save and send there. And then we'll be able to use their services all at once. Speaking of crew, there appears to be one right over there. In a rather unfortunate circumstance. It seems they ended up getting frozen by these angels here. I would criticize him for that, but they did mention that he took down 30 of them before succumbing, so that's actually fairly impressive. Especially considering how much trouble I just had with these 2 here. Unfortunately, we can't free them as of just yet. We'll need a source of intense heat before we can do that. So, pretty much everything you saw in this room was 100% optional. If you don't care about any of those items, which you should, it's good stuff, even the mana charm. But if you don't care about that, you can just head straight across to the left and head straight to the boss. So if you want to, say, get through the game speedily, I guess you'd want to do that. Before encountering the boss ourselves, we're gonna rest at this statue here though. We're a bit low on HP and MP, and being at full for bosses is generally a good idea. I know that's a rather unusual bit of advice, but please take me at my word on that. So one thing we'll be doing here, and doing before most bosses, is changing our down spell back from the useful Ice Pillar for exploring to the Sacred Wind, which is more useful for combat since it gives a not insignificant speed buff. So this here is Distan, a Judicator, one of the Angel's Black Ops agents. He's kind of annoying because after you attack him a bunch, he'll put up his guard and then disappear. You have no idea where he'll show up. He'll usually show up at one of the ends of the screens, but sometimes he'll show up in the middle for a surprise attack. And this is where Adelan comes in super handy. She can proc bleed pretty reliably, especially with an agility build. And as long as it's active, and admittedly it doesn't last all that long, but it lasts just long enough. As long as it's active, you are able to tell where Distan is even when he's disappeared, and this gives you so much of an advantage over him. It lets you know exactly what he's going to do and thus predict him incredibly reliably. So, aside from Distan himself, the most troubling aspect of the fight is that as the fight goes on and as his HP lowers, he'll summon minions. The worst of it is these big shield dudes at half health and 1/4 health. I recommend clearing the first away so things don't get too hectic. He'll also regularly spawn in angels, but they're easy enough to take down quickly. So, other than that, I don't have too much else to say about him, other than that he is incredibly easy to parry. Like, the parry timing in this game is pretty generous, but it feels extra generous with him for some reason. Like, you can end up blocking pretty damn early and still end up parrying most of his stuff. And that combined with perfect guard ensuring that we can parry everything he can do, and he's not really much trouble at all. That's why I recommend picking up the parry skill on every character ASAP. It is so useful for so many of the humanoid bosses, and there are a lot of humanoid bosses. The only character that doesn't have the ability to parry is Gilda, but she's strong enough otherwise that she really doesn't need to be able to parry to clown on most enemies. And speaking of clowning, Distan is just about dead. Good thing too, since we were actually nearly running out of our A time score. And where would we be without our ass? So, we didn't actually kill him, and he is being rather mopey about it, so let's rub it in even more. What's the worst that could happen from leaving him alive? Nothing, he's pathetic. So I mentioned before that picking up that MP boosting skill from the magic skill tree was more of a means to an end than an end itself. And that end is right here, the Divine Command skill. This upgrades the Soul of the Centurion, one of the souls that we started with, the offensive magic. And this is really crucial. Upgrading souls increases the effect of their magic as well as the MP cost, so keep that in mind if you're only just barely able to cast a spell. But it's absolutely worth doing if you can, because the damage boost is pretty significant. It does a lot to keep our God Hand skill competitive for a little bit longer. The unfortunate thing though is that that's the only way to upgrade the Soul of the Centurion, and you can only do it once, compared to the various souls that you end up collecting as each of the characters, which you can end up upgrading 2 times. So it ends up falling by the wayside, especially if you end up being a more magic-focused build, but for the early to mid-game it's quite useful. Anyway, we finally arrived at Ishq. So the second pathway above, that's the one that the Skyway leads to, which means, assuming that there's not like a huge gulf of distance that is skipped in between the stages, the sewers are literally right next to the Skyway. A little bit odd that. So before we finish things off, we're just gonna steal this man's steel treasure. Not just the regular steel, but the good stuff as well, the stuff he's hiding up here. The Tama Hagane, which if you know anything, it's basically just the best quality iron that the Japanese had, which means it's garbage iron because all of Japan's iron was utter trash. But it's an important material to acquire. There are 10 in the game, and you want to save them. Don't spend them freely, I'll go into more of that later. For now though, that's enough. Goodbye.